welcome to everybody joining us today. I've had a long career in internal audit, and I always thought about the three critical success factors for internal auditors. Number one is doing the right audits at the right time. It doesn't help to do the right audits at the wrong time, and it doesn't help to not do the right audits. Number two is to provide insight, foresight, and leading practices on every single audit you conduct. And three, to help the organization you work for achieve its goals, its objectives, and its strategic plan. Yet studies, some of which we'll review today, show or demonstrate that internal audit, senior management, and boards have a lot to still learn regarding strategic risk management. Not so much identifying the top 10 risks, but in particular, implementing such risk into strategy, operations, creating dashboards to monitor both known and emerging risks, and to build continuity or resilience plans along with crisis management plans. And that's our topic today, particularly the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats that are presented through strategic risk management, and how we as internal auditors can build our brand and add value to the organization. So when you think about it, let's start with some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. If as internal auditors, we fail to audit the right things at the right time, or we fail to provide that insight and foresight that's necessary, people will begin to ask questions. Where was internal audit? Why didn't they do that audit? Or if they did the audit, why wasn't their recommendations, their advice, meaningful enough to prevent the situation from happening? Or maybe, do we have the right chief audit executive leading our internal audit function? I'll give you a specific example. The Institute of Internal Auditors puts out an annual Pulse of the Profession, wanting to hear what chief audit executives think about the profession. And just a year ago, when they put out the 2020 Pulse of the Profession, chief audit executives, once again for like the third year in a row, cited cybersecurity as one of the very top risks that their organizations faced. Yet, for the second or third year in a row, they acknowledged that as chief audit executives, as internal auditors, they were not doing enough to add value to helping mitigate that significant risk to the organization. Something has to change, or the chief audit executive will be changed. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, a retail organization, the facilities group, decided that they could reduce costs, reduce energy usage by bringing in a new automated, tied to the internet, HVAC system. They put all the paperwork together, sent the appropriation requests to the finance folks who signed off on the ROI, and it went. Not one person thought through the cyber implications, since it was going to be connected to the internet. Nobody talked to IT or the cyber folks. When that system was breached by the cyber criminals, lots of people lost their job, including the chief audit executive. A few months after that, another retailer had a cyber incident, but they didn't replace their chief audit executive because that person had been pounding the table for months about the lack of controls, the need for additional controls, the leading practices regarding cyber. What the board learned in that situation is they needed to listen more to the courageous chief audit executive who was bringing to them the risks and the solutions that they weren't always listening to. And at Raytheon, one of the things that we learned is as you read about these kinds of events, you need to stop and pause and ask yourself, could that happen to your company? And so after that first event with the retailer, the IT organization, the engineers, internal audit, we started to think through how do we identify every single point of entry and exit between an office, a factory, any Raytheon location in the internet. And we started to inventory every single one of those. And we started to proactively address what we learned from that retailer. And as internal auditors, I encourage you to study these failures outside of your organization and step back and think about how it might affect you. You know, while we're on cyber for a moment, just let me digress that the risk is much more than what the media portrays. And it's far more technical and complex than just phishing and malware. In fact, a fairly recent study showed 2 out of every 3 companies in the study admitted that they were breached in the last 2 years. 2 out of 3. And you have to wonder how many of the 1 out of 3 that said no, maybe were breached, you just didn't want to admit it. But 67% admitted they've been breached in the last 2 years. And anyone using SAP or Oracle, which is almost everybody, is at target, because that's who the cyber criminals are going after every single day. Cyber criminals are better funded than most of our organizations. They've adopted the IIA's motto, sharing through progress. They actually share leading practices amongst each other, and they collaborate between countries and between groups in order to get a greater advantage in what they're trying to achieve. In fact, even Oracle and SAP recognize that their systems have holes, and as they find those holes, they put out patches. But when they put out the patch and they explain what the patch is for and how, it takes most companies today months to receive the patch, to research the patch, to test the patch, and then implement the patch. In the meantime, they're vulnerable. And there's been studies shown that within 72 hours of patches being released, the bad guys, the cyber criminals, have been able to take advantage and break into organizations. And we've seen companies that have admitted that the part of the reason why they had a breach is because they hadn't closed the patch fast enough. So there's a lot of activity going on in cyber. It's changing very quickly. But if we don't change things, then something is going to change in the internal audit world. And I will tell you that in the last year and a half, I've been doing a lot of consulting with a cyber company. We've been studying these breaches. And I've come to the conclusion, and I've been advocating to ISACA and to the IA, that IT general controls are no longer sufficient enough to prevent these cyber attacks and these cyber criminals. And the approach internal audit needs to take has to change. If it doesn't, then the company is going to change us. Now, just a few closing thoughts on cyber, and we'll get back to the general topic of strategic risk management. As internal auditors, when the CAE said that the reason why they weren't doing enough is they didn't feel qualified enough. We've got to get over that fear. As internal auditors, we must learn more about cyber, and we must use subject matter experts whose cyber is their core discipline to help us in order to do that. And let's also not forget the close relationship between cyber and privacy. Europe has one privacy rule. In the United States, we can set them up by state. So California and New York are leading, but as an organization, you might have 50 different requirements in the US, one in Europe. But what happens is if the cyber criminals get into your system and they take PII, personal identifiable information, for your customers, your employees, there are millions of dollars of fines that have been leveraged. And so while privacy is a complex risk all by itself, it's interrelated to cyber. And so many risks that we'll be talking about throughout the day are interrelated, and we need to be thinking about how they're interrelated. But don't also forget that the SEC and the PCAOB have cyber high on their radar risk. And there are people advocating to the SEC that we need a new SOX-like certification program for cyber. Just imagine what that would be like. And finally, one of my closest associates at Raytheon was the head of cybersecurity. When I talk to chief audit executives across the globe, they don't have that close working relationship. That person should be one of your best friends. They can help that organization help internal audit understand cyber and its implications. You can help them understand controls and audit approaches. And together, they need our voice with senior management and the board to help them understand the risk around cyber and the new tools that we need and the new controls that we need. Internal audit should be partnering with the cyber folks day in and day out. Now let's go back to the slide and look at the second challenge. And regulators, shareholders are pushing boards hard. Why didn't the board anticipate that risk that kept us from achieving the strategic plan? How did they miss it? How did they not react properly? Just think back to the Volkswagen situation or the Wells Fargo situation. There's one that just popped last week. An energy company in the Midwest agreed to pay a $230 million fine and a consent agreement going forward for bribing state officials. people at the CEO level, at the board level, chief audit executives are losing their jobs because of these failures in risk management. And it's up to us to start taking more action. As I said, risk is complex and often interdependent on other risks. Let me give you another example. When the pandemic hit, the global auto industry felt sales were going to drop dramatically. So they immediately cut back in supply chain all of their orders, including computer chips. Now, cars today have so many computers. If you don't have computer chips, it doesn't matter if the car is complete. You can't ship it without the computer chips. And they just assumed that when business picked up, they would just reorder them. They didn't realize that the semiconductor companies weren't going to sit idle. They were looking for other ways to ship those chips to other people. And the pandemic drove sales on iPads and electronics and iPhones and games. And so they started selling all that new excess capacity to other users. But also at the same time, the industry, the semiconductor industry, faced several catastrophic failures that dramatically reduced capacity. Losing one plant to a fire, severe weather conditions in Taiwan where so many of the chips are made. And when the auto industry came back and said, well, we need those chips, they can't get them. And estimates are billions of dollars in lost opportunity costs to the auto industry as cars sit waiting for those chips. U.S. dealerships have between 20 and 30% of a normal inventory. And so when we think of strategic mismanagement, boards are under the pressure to really think about the ramifications in the second and third order and how they all relate together. And when internal audit, when we bring these issues to the table, when we can bring white papers and leading practice and help our organization think differently about strategic risk management and how to implement that properly, then we demonstrate our value to the organization and we help the organization achieve its goals and objectives. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But it gives us in these opportunities the opportunity to change how people think about us and provide the thoughts to help our company be more successful. Now, I'd like to step back and think about I think everyone should either have audited ERM in the last year or two, or if not, be doing it now. And so this slide gets you to think about if you haven't done it or you're going to do it again, start with a comprehensive audit of ERM and business continuity, including the benchmarking to frame your recommendations for improvement. It is so important. Too many auditors have said, I don't do an audit in ERM because I don't feel comfortable. Even some of the pre-submitted questions dealt with the lack of comfort. We can't hide our eyes anymore. We need to use the advantages of white papers. White papers lay out all the key issues. So if you're suggesting something be done, and they say, Larry, what makes you think you're right? Well, when I can show them 4 white papers from authorities saying that's what needs to be done, it helps. When I can show the board the kinds of questions they should be asking management, it makes a difference. But in order to do that, and we're going to walk through in a little bit how you might do an ERM audit, but you also need to do a self-assessment within internal audit. Do you have the right skills? Do you have the right tools? Do you have the right resources? Because today, the skills we need for internal audit are different than just a year or two ago. And what we're going to need in the year or two is very different than what we have now. And so we must become more dynamic. We must be able to utilize subject matter experts when we need. And too often when the audit committee, Richard Chambers used to say the worst question the audit committee could ask is, do you have enough resources? The better question is, based on the top 10 risks, what audits can't you do because you don't have the right people or the right tools or the right resources? Because ultimately, it's important for us to make sure if we're not having the discussion with the audit committee and with management, then when the problem comes, it's on our shoulder for not discussing it, just like those 2 CAEs I talked about in retail regarding cyber. So make sure you have a frank conversation, not once a year, but regularly with the audit committee and management. And when you're having those conversations, at Raytheon, we used to meet 4 to 6 times a year in the audit committee. I didn't just talk about the audit reports we just issued. Today, audit committees want you to look forward. And so I would use those meetings to talk about risk management, emerging risk, risk appetite, changes in regulations that could affect the company, fraud, culture within the company. And I would do all that by sharing white papers. I would always have 1 or 2 white papers in every single pre-read material for the audit committee on these various topics, from the IA, from Protiviti, E&Y, PwC, so many others. You see, when you show them what the experts in that field are saying, it helps them recognize you as helping to educate them and as someone who knows what's going on. It helps them ask management the right questions. And it allows us to partner with management and the audit committee to make sure the right things are happening. So one of the white papers I want to walk you through today, Protiviti partners every year with North Carolina State. And this is the latest one for 2021 reviewing of ERM practices. So my first question is, do you share your white papers with your audit committee? This is a great one that you could do that. And when you go through here, they talk about that risk and complexity is the highest level in 12 years. It's driven by the pandemic, the social unrest across the globe, not just in the United States, elections, interest rates, and a host of other triggers. And no organization, whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit, or a government organization, is immune from these risks. And the fact that these risks are not independent of each other, in often cases they're interdependent of each other. And they talk in the report about the fact that risk management has to be a board priority because organizations are facing that increased pressure from stakeholders and regulators. And board members are losing their jobs because they're not affecting this right. And in the study that they just completed, over 2/3 of those studied, 67% stated that after 10, 12, 15 years we've been talking about ERM, but 2/3 stated that they still lack a complete ERM process. And fewer than half that responded described their risk management process as mature. And when you think about the companies that have failed to achieve their strategic plan or their goals and objectives, it all starts with risk management. And if you don't have a mature process or you're not comfortable in your process, that's why internal audit should be auditing these now. They also identify that organizations struggle, not so much identifying the top 10, but how do they implement them into strategic planning? And only 30% of those surveyed were either mostly or very satisfied that the key risk indicators were in various dashboards. So step back for a second. So organizations are okay with coming up at the top 10. They struggle with driving them into the goals and objectives and across every function. They don't feel they have a mature process, and they don't have metrics or dashboards in place to monitor the existing risks or the changing risks or the emerging risks. That's a high-risk situation for internal auditors to not do anything about. Now let's look at another study, the Gartner group. This is a group that does a lot of work with IT and with IT organizations, but they do everything from IT to global business. And so this is one of those that I would subscribe to as Raytheon through our IT organization because they were a key partner with Gartner. And so this was a study that Gartner just put out in 2021 on risk management as well. This is one that you could share with your audit committee because, again, it raises great questions. First and foremost, in the executive summary, risks are not sufficiently incorporated into strategic planning. Now, here's 2 studies in a row saying that's a big risk. So the audit committee can be asking management, describe for me how you're doing that. And internal audit can be helping management with implementing the leading practices from these white papers on how to make that happen. They say risk management consideration during strategy execution is insufficient. Organizations have unacceptable exposure to third-party risk. We're going to talk more about third-party risk. You're only as strong as your weakest link. And even within cyber, if you do everything in your organization, but those third parties that work with supply chain are weak, not doing what you need, then the cyber criminals can get in through those third parties to your organization. They also concluded that business continuity plans don't deal with the unexpected, which is why you need crisis management as well. And once again, organizations are not detecting risk. And when they do, it's too late to react. And then a new one that they identified is organizations are ill-prepared to manage the risk of business model changes post-pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were starting to see dramatic change. If you've seen the recent video from the chairman of the IA, Charlie Wright, it's all about this technology boom, this technology change. And he is professing that within the next 10 years, we'll see more technological change than in the first 2,000 years. or the last 2,000 years. And companies were going through this before the pandemic hit, but we all know how much everything changed after the pandemic. And what they're saying is risk people are concerned we're not thinking that through properly. They also brought up the area of culture, that if you don't have an alignment between the culture and the risk management mindset, then you're going to have breakdowns. We'll talk some more about that. And that risk managers are really concerned today that decisions are being taken outside of risk appetite. That as people are focusing on how to get through COVID, they're ignoring the risk appetite. And I'll tell you that risk appetite was a tough discussion at Raytheon, having people understand what it was. But it's so important to make sure there's alignment so you don't have, and we've seen this with the investment bankers, where people have made big bets that people didn't realize that have cost the organization millions or billions of dollars. Now, I want to just change gears for just a moment because E&Y put out a great study on how internal audit can make the future internal auditor a reality today. And here's one of the things they start off with. 60% of our profession still do an annual risk assessment and an annual audit plan. You put an annual audit plan together that gets approved in November or December, with the way risks are changing, it could become obsolete by February. And yet we still have internal auditors who measure success factors as did I complete my audit plan? And what E&Y is saying here is you need to have a dynamic audit plan that might change every month. Because as risks change, you need to add audits and subtract audits. You need to be doing the highest risk audits to your organization, not just what you planned. So they suggest moving from a single point in time to more of a dynamic and continually refreshed process. Are you one of the 60% or are you one of the 40%? And they talk a lot about the need for internal audit to become more agile and respond to these dynamic events, as well as, we've heard it before, rethinking our needed audit skills, taking advantage of the diverse workforce, recognizing the skill set we need today was different than 2 years ago, and it's going to be very different than 2 years from now. And what are you doing in this next point as organizations are driving digital change? What are you doing in internal audit to drive digital change? And how well are you striking the balance between the right technology for internal audit and the creative people who can use it to drive the kind of change in your organization? Would you say that your audit committee and your management describe your audit function or you as a leader as transformational? If not, you want to address that. And once again, what E&Y talks about is it isn't just about talking to the audit committee about the audit reports you've issued or the findings, that we need to be forward-looking and giving them insight into what's happening in the business, what's happening in the industry, what's happening around global risks. This is how we take and create a world-class internal audit function that is aligned around the key risks that our organization is facing, so that we can audit those high risks and make a difference to our organization. Now, I selected a PwC white paper. And one of the things they emphasize is not every company is the same, not every culture is the same. And so one size doesn't fit all. And as internal auditors, we need to think about all these white papers and all these suggestions. Which ones would work within our company? Which ones wouldn't? You ought to pick and choose the ones we're going to drive. But here are some of their observations. Risk appetite needs to be agreed to, not just at the board level and the CEO, but across the organization. We must ensure it's defined for all major risks so that people know what's an acceptable risk and what's an unacceptable risk. We need to ensure the organization's culture aligns with the appetite. Here's culture again. Develop effective continuous monitoring tools again. Providing the proper assurance. One of the things they talk about is we're not doing as good a job as we can in providing the document, in providing the disclosure in the 10K and other documents. And so when something happens, there's a class action lawsuit right away. So they really push in theirs about not just thinking about the risk, but how are we disclosing those? And are they as transparent as they could be? And they talk about the need to integrate risk management into the business planning process, the strategic planning process, the decision-making process. Aligning desired behaviors and performance with incentives. And here they're talking about some of the problems that Volkswagen and Wells Fargo, is the incentive programs didn't create the behavior that they wanted. Some would argue it absolutely did create the behavior that the CEO wanted, but not necessarily what the board wanted. And so PwC talks about making sure as internal audits, when you're looking at ERM, you're looking at the incentive programs, because people look at the incentive program and say, that's what they really want me to do. That's what they're paying me to do. And they want us to embody the early warning systems. And so you start to see that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be an expert in ERM, but you can summarize 3 or 4 of the top white papers and help management and the board see and understand kind of what's happening or what needs to happen or where the gaps are. So let's talk about if you were going to do an ERM audit. Here's how I would approach it today. The first part of the audit would be focusing with management and the board on risk appetite, helping them understand what is risk appetite, what does it mean, and what is the appetite of the organization, and how do we communicate that? The next part of the audit, and these would be done, in conjunction with each other, not independently, but how does the board and management determine those top risks, often the top 10? How do they determine those, and how do they communicate those across the organization? And you move it down to the next level. I would be working with management to determine how do they get them into the strategic plan and the goals and objectives for every single function. And I would be talking to the people that run the incentive programs to determine whether those incentive programs are aligned with what we're talking about. And I would make sure that I'm talking and auditing around who owns all the third parties and what controls do we have in place and what do we want to do in terms of management of third parties. And I could give you a whole similar document on how to audit third parties, but not today. And then I would start to look at how does management monitor these emerging, what dashboards do we have on the current risks, but more importantly, the emerging risks. And I'd want to know that someone's watching those and they're looking at how they interrelate to each other. Then I would also have a part of the audit that's looking at the culture of the organization. What is their culture and does it align with what we're talking about? And finally, I'd have a part that would focus on what are we doing to transform the business pre or post pandemic, and how will that impact all of this that we're talking about? So this is not an easy audit in one sense. It takes some time and you need some subject matter experts, but there's so much great information out there on every one of those bullets so that you can educate yourself, but you can utilize those to help drive the points. So it's not Larry's recommending this and it doesn't make sense. This is what PwC, E&Y, Gartner, others have recommended. Well, geez, it's kind of hard to argue all those people. And so you utilize those to help you grow. So one of the things I thought would be helpful for you is I went through about 24 risk analysis or risk assessments by various different organizations. And I thought I'd put together here for you kind of a full list of what they're saying. Some may apply to your company, some may not. But first and foremost, everybody's talking about the pandemic that doesn't seem to end. Just when we thought we turned the corner, we now have the Delta variant. And now I'm told that there's another variant, and there'll probably be hundreds more variants coming forward. So it's the pandemic that won't end. The pandemic has resulted in very high debt levels. As countries have been trying to keep their economy propped up, they've used up most of their financial flexibility. Workers are displaced across the globe. There's a growing inequality and the lost trust and faith in government. Countries lack, as I say, financial flexibility. And so what are they doing? They're looking at increasing taxes. And so that has an impact on our organizations and new regulations. And there was always a talent shortage before the pandemic. And then when companies said you can work from anywhere, it's okay. Some people moved from New York City to Iowa. And now when they're told they have to move back to New York City, they're going to say, no, I don't want to do that. I'll go to work for a company that lets me continue to work in Iowa. And so most of the studies show that there's going to be an even worse talent shortage because as companies try to go back to the way they were, employees don't want to go back to the way they were. Political turmoil, U.S., China, Russia, Middle East, every place you turn around, there's political turmoil that's impacting your global business. Climate change. We'll talk some more about climate change, but there's such a drive behind what do we need to do to save this planet? And it affects companies and disclosures. global supply chain shortages, not just the ones we talked about like with the automobile industry, but are you aware of China going out to across the continent of Africa and buying entire elements? They're trying to monopolize certain minerals or certain elements that is going to have a long-term impact. Look at when the U.S. went into the pandemic, we finally realized we had outsourced over 90% of our pharmaceuticals to China. And people were upset about that. They wanted to bring it back to the U.S. So we need to be thinking about what other countries are doing and who's doing what business and what is the impact on us. And of course, we've talked about cyber, the digitalization and business transformation. We could spend an entire hour just on that. Think about what Uber and Lyft and Airbnb have totally disrupted businesses. Who could disrupt your business? What could disrupt your business? An increased focus on government regulations, data privacy, rising interest rates. They can't stay this low forever. Impact on government debt, resistance to change, coupled with the company's inability to quickly adapt IT infrastructure or operations to adjust to the new environment. There's still an inability to use data analytics to achieve market intelligence and the ability to timely identify emerging risks. It goes on. Fraud, FCPA, there's still issues. We just talked earlier today about First Energy, and we talked about the Volkswagen and the Wells Fargo. How about the agility and the ability to quickly adapt to the business transformation? And this next one, President Trump came in, he changed out the SEC and he changed out the PCOB with people that he wanted to drive a certain direction. And then soon as President Biden came in, he changed out the SEC again in the PCAOB. And so this swinging back and forth has a big impact on companies and organizations. In this last one, I didn't get it from any of the studies. But if we're not re-engineering internal audit ourselves, we're not going to be ready to deal with all those big crises. And so it's so important for us to be able to do that. So I also wanted just to share you, every major insurance company puts out their own risk, what they think of the top 10. And I wanted to focus on a couple here that I hadn't focused on and the others that I had looked at. Regulatory changes with respect to trade wars, tariffs, sanctions, protectionism. Those are things we heard a lot over the last 4 years. Natural storms, natural disasters, storms, floods, wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes. These are things that at Raytheon, we had a crisis management plan. So the minute there was talk of a hurricane, the crisis management team went into effect to monitor that, to track that, to make sure we had the right things in place. And then they also talk here about third-party supply chain and making sure you're protected from fire, explosion, and other things that would keep your supply chain group from delivering the kinds of products you need. I thought I'd just give you some other examples here of audits we've done within Raytheon. I told you we've done an audit of ERM. In corporate culture, rather than do an individual audit, what we did is we sat down and came up with 10 questions that we thought were the right questions to ask. Are you afraid to speak up? If you've got an innovative idea, do you feel as though that you can present that and people will listen to you? Do you understand the goals and objectives for your function or for the company? And so on every single audit we did, we would ask everybody we interviewed from the lowest level to the highest level these same 10 questions. We'd share the results with the people we were auditing, but what we did is we accumulated them over a 3 or 4 month period of time, and then we'd sit down with senior management and the audit committee and share the results of what we're seeing from a corporate culture standpoint. Do people really understand from top to bottom Raytheon's goals and objectives, Raytheon's mission? Do people feel as though they can raise their hand if there's a problem? Do people feel as though their innovative ideas are being listened to? This is the way we handle corporate culture. Early on, we got involved in sustainability reporting. Raytheon was putting out sustainability reports as early as, I think, 2011. And they were doing it to showcase the things they were doing to reduce energy usage, or water usage, or to improve our diversity statistics, et cetera. And so they put out a report the first year, and I recognized none of that stuff was audited, not like the 10K, the 10Q, or the financial statements. And so I sat down with senior management and suggested that an internal audit go in and audit each of the functions that provided the information. Make sure we had a documented process. make sure that the collection of the information was accurate, and make sure we had the same kind of controls, because when we released that report, it was a public document that people were going to rely on. And so back in I think 2012, we did a sustainability audit. We did a lot of work, as I said, in fraud, supply chain risk, third-party risk, cyber data privacy, in digitalization and technology. Probably the year before I retired, the company decided in supply chain and in shared services that they wanted to implement bots. They wanted to eliminate all the manual transactions that people were doing, replace them with bots, and then use people to analyze the output rather than create all the input. And when they went out to bid, each of the companies that bid said, in addition to you and I, you need to have two other departments working with you. First, you need HR, because this is going to transform your workplace. And it's going to have lots of ramifications in the workplace. And we need HR there. And we need internal audit. Because while Betty or Charlie might be able to do 100 transactions an hour, the bot's going to do 10,000 an hour. And so if we don't get the controls right, if we don't get the process right, if we don't have someone like internal audit giving us that independent review, we could end up making a lot of mistakes on your behalf. And so internal audit did a lot of work around the bots. In fact, my number two guy, Tom Sangler, was so involved in the technology changes that were happening across Raytheon that he worked with the IA and he wrote a book, Auditing and Disruptive Technology, helping auditors understand what is this disruptive technology and how do we think about it as an auditor. So, for instance, when bots are being created, what are the things you have to think about? What are the things you have to remember? What are the things you have to work through as an internal auditor? We did work in business continuity and crisis management, pension management, investment strategy. Raytheon, fortunately for me, not so much for other companies, we had a nice pension plan. And so the Treasury folks had to invest billions of dollars to make sure those Treasury funds, and they had strategies. And we went in with subject matter experts to make sure that the strategies were well documented. So in some cases, one strategy was in case inflation went up, and another strategy was if it went down. And we had to look at the rationale behind all of those strategies to make sure we were maximizing not just the internal controls, but the return on those investments. And E&Y was instrumental in helping us do that. We did a lot of work on our international operations as well. So as we kind of come to wrap this up, I want you to think about how you can add greater value to yourself and to your organization. It starts with reading as many of these white papers as you can on ERM and on risk management. And one of the advantages you have with a great organization like Audit Board is they can help connect you with others like you. You see, they, like the IA, believe in progress through sharing. And as a profession, people share audit programs, audit approach, where the gold nuggets were hidden. So if you haven't benchmarked and audited your ERM process, you got to do it. Leverage your experience, leverage the white papers, leverage your peers and Audit Board. And ensure that your organization has a system in place to track the changes. Don't be afraid to do it. Ask yourself if you've assessed your own function, the skills, the expertise, the resources, the subject matter experts, the tools. And if you don't have what you need, make sure you every single quarter when you're talking to the audit committee, you're sharing with them where your gaps are, and not just you're greedy looking for more people or more money, but these gaps mean I can't do these kinds of audits. And change your conversations with the audit committee to not just be, here's the audit reports I issued this quarter and this is what they mean, but talk about key risks, emerging risks, leading practices, what's going on with cyber, regulatory changes, fraud. Demonstrate to them that internal audit is on top of all of these key risks. We're spending our time understanding what's happening, where the gaps are across industry, where the leading practices are, and we're a champion for change. And make sure that you incorporate the ERM considerations to every audit you do. So if you're going to audit something in accounting, you're going to audit something in supply chain, understand what were the key risks, how did they get flowed through to the goals and objectives, how are they being managed as part of your audit, It's not just about internal controls. It's about helping your organization achieve its goals and objectives. And I ask you to ask yourself, are you doing enough in cyber, third-party risk, business changes as a result of the pandemic of disruptive technologies? This is the best of time for internal auditors. There is so much value that we can bring. There's so much investment. When I was the chairman of the IA, my whole theme was invest in yourself. If we have everybody that works for us investing in themselves on these key risk areas, if we hire people that have the skills that we're lacking, we can truly build our brand. We can help our organization with strategic risk management. We can help make sure they build it into all of the business plans and the strategic planning and the goals and objectives. We can help them with continuous monitoring, and we can do the audits of these key areas and bring to them the innovation, the insight, the foresight, and the leading practices so that our organization has a greater chance of succeeding and exceeding shareholder expectations. And I want all of you to recognize that if you're not part of the change, then someone's liable to change you. And I want you to be that change agent that makes a difference. I am so proud to be an internal auditor. I spent my entire life almost in internal audit. I spent some time as VP of HR, VP of operations, and VP of finance as well, but most of it is in internal audit. And it gives you an opportunity to leverage change across the entire organization. And so I hope this has been helpful to you.